This is an interview on the 30th of April 2005 with Corporal Donald Alexander Daniels, VX142391, V66054, 39th Battalion, A Company, 7 Platoon. Well, first of all, Don, how did you come to join the Army?
Firstly, I think I was inspired by my brother-in-law who would join the RAF. I asked my father, could I join the Army? He said no. He said, you were far too young. We'll have to leave it at that. He said, it's just no way. He said, I'd give you consent. At the time, I was starting to call up for personnel for the militia, which they referred to then as 3 months in and 3 months out. So I went along to the Victorian Scottish Regiment and joined up by putting my age up a year. They never queried it because at the time things were quite serious, and in common terms, I suppose you say they'd take anybody, so they took me.
So in fact, how old were you?
I was 17 then. So I joined the Scottish Regiment and went in to did one camp down at Mount Martha. When no sooner were in, when they came around and were calling for volunteers to join the 39th Battalion, which they were forming as an expeditionary unit to go up to New Guinea as a guard garrison. So I applied for it and met my colleague, my Ted Stewart, and we stood at the drill hall in Richmond, and he said, I'll go if you go. It's a debatable point today, but however, we're still sorting it out who said what. So we both joined the 39th Battalion. We then left the drill hall and trained to Darley, whereupon we were issued with our uniforms and started training. Now, our training at this stage was still open warfare. It had nothing to do with the jungle. And we were told that by going up to New Guinea to bring your tennis racket, just tennis shoes, there'd be Polynesian girls dancing on the beaches, and there'd be just pure and simply a garrison battalion. And this sounded very exciting, and it sounded and the first time would have been my first episode of going on a ship. It was the tail end of the Depression, whereas my father found it rather difficult during those years because he worked at Wertheim's, which was a piano manufacturing company, and of course pianos were one of the first companies to go during a Depression. So Ted and I joined, and we did our service at Darley. And on a Sunday, we used to go into town, into Bacchus Marsh, and go to a church service, mainly because, I suppose, we got talking to a couple of the girls. Alan Rennie was in this. And after church, of course, they invited us home for supper. And, of course, having cream cakes and scones and a cup of coffee and so on. And we'd catch the last bus back to camp at Darley. Having completed our training then at Darley on the December of that same year, which was 1941, we left and sailed for New Guinea. There was talk at the time that we were on our way to rebel. Now, this is a debatable story. I can't speak too much of it, but apparently it was because rebel needed reinforcing. Although we never had permission. We went away as an expeditionary unit, and the only reason we were allowed to go to New Guinea because New Guinea was a mandated territory of Australia. They couldn't send us any further. So on board, we crammed in with the 53rd Battalion and supporting troops, which were dozens of them. Ted and I were posted down on F deck. Now, F deck is down below the waterline. And it was hot, and it was claustrophobia I had, of course, and so on. So it was the first time we ever volunteered to go and to go up on deck and be a submarine spotter. So which meant we were situated in a forward turret, which was very pleasant. We had the sea breeze, and we just sort of sat there looking for submarines. Well, we wouldn't have known a submarine if we had already seen one. However, we did our duty there. Boys on deck at the time, there was boat drill, of course, and the chaps were getting their hair cut ready for the tropics. It was a case of having them shave. I had mine clipped to a stubble, but I didn't believe in shaving them because the sunstroke and the sun was so severe there, so I left it as a stubble. So we arrived in Port Moresby, but only the fact that the Aquitania was so big it couldn't berth the wharf, so we had to transfer from the Aquitania onto the destroyer, the Swan, and be let off at the wharf. We assembled at the wharf and off we trudged for a 7-mile walk to our destination, which was what they referred to as the 7-mile drome, which today they call the Jackson airstrip. Jackson being the commander of the Kitty Hawks squadron. So marching along, of course, it was terribly hot and we had all our gear and it was really hard going. It was in the dead of night and eventually we arrived at our destination, plonked down on the grass, of course, and in the morning we woke up and all we could see was the airstrip.
So what were your facilities like?
Facilities at that time was nil. We had no tents. We had no shovels to dig out latrines. We had no mosquito nets. The mosquito nets were there by the millions. And one way may ask, well, why didn't you? Why weren't this equipment there ready for you? And the reason being, it was on the wharf down in Melbourne. And why wouldn't they be sent up? Because the wharfies were on strike. So we had to wait until after the strike, until the ships got up there, that we received mosquito nets, mosquito repellent, and numerous scrub typhus treatment and so on. Quinine was a daily dosage, which we took in liquid form. We had to line up, and the officer would come along with a bottle and a spoon. If you were first in line, it was quite clean. The spoon was clean, and the contents were shocking. It was terrible to take quinine, but if you were on the end of the line, the spoon was never washed. And if at the time it got down to the end of the line, the spoon would be green. So it was a horrible, horrible thing. We were no sooner there than we started getting Jap raids. The bombers came over. Their ceiling would only be about 8 to 10,000 feet. They couldn't fly any higher in those days because they didn't have pressurised cabins. So needless to say, we had a good view. But we had no anti-aircraft guns. So resistance was no good at firing a 303. So resistance, there was no, they just flew around all day and night. We had Tokyo Rose, of course. She broadcast particularly with a full moon. And she used to refer, not the rats of Tobruk, we were the mice of Moresby. And she used to inform us, we'll see you later. And sure enough, over they would come with that whoom, 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 and we had nothing. Until such time as we did. We got ACAC, and they were militia. And to take the record onto that, they shot down more planes in Port Moresby than they shot down in the Middle East. So it was quite a thing. But the Japs followed our planes down from Rabaul, having bombed there, to try to catch them on the ground. But the planes flew from Queensland to Rabaul and other places, came back to Port Moresby, refuelled and flew back to Australia. Our duty in those days was to roll out drummers, having set our planes back to Queensland in case they came over with towing gliders that would have prevented them, naturally, of course, from landing. the drone guard that lasted quite some time in between unloading ships and in between digging defensive positions. We dug that many holes in New Guinea. I think one of these days it was going to sink because there was holes everywhere.
Did you actually do any training while you were there?
There's no such thing as training. We had no training whatsoever. There was more importance put on the supplies coming up. And the only ones there at the time then was our troops, which were available to unload not only the McDury, there was also the Wanaka. And that was a cargo ship which mainly supplied the Air Force. It carried bombs and Air Force equipment. We didn't like unloading that because there was nothing on it that you could get any value out of, because unloading the ships on the Miduri, you'd throw over on the winches a basket full of tin fruit. And as soon as it got about 3 feet off the pier, you'd throw the switch and the thing used to hit the deck, and a couple of the cans would split or break. Well, they were of no value, so we used to grab those, go down underneath the wharf and have a nice feed of sliced peastage.
Where were you actually camped? And can you remember who you were camped, who was in your tent or who you shared your tent with?
A chap by the name of, Steve Vance was our officer. We had Reg Wilcox, Ted Stewart, J.D. Mackay, Shady Smith, Don Charlton. I think that was our group at that time. That's a hard question, to be exactly who was in the tent at that time.
No, that's fine.
Because we were sorting things out, who wanted to be in what platoon and what have you. NCOs were made fairly quickly because we didn't go in as with rank. A few of them came in with rank. They didn't come to an infantry section. They went to more as the Bren carriers or something, the equivalent, whatever.
Can you tell us the story when you were guarding the drone about the pillbox?
Yes, I think it must have been Department of Works or some of the equivalent. We didn't have any concrete, but they built a pillbox for our safety because the Japs, as I say, bombed day and night. Even the old Ford and the junker, we had a junker there, aircraft which was made out of galvanised iron. It used to fly the gold from below down to Port Moresby. And they soon put a bomb into that. And while we were guarding the drum, we used to roll 44-gallon drums out onto the airstrip in case in the event of the Japs landing gliders. They couldn't find the glide because the planes had already gone back to Australia. But we did have at the time a nice watermelon patch on the side, and not far from there was our latrines. And on this particular occasion, having tested it, the watermelon was ready for eating. And the Japs came over and put one bomb in the watermelon patch and one bomb down our latrine, which sort of ruined the whole situation.
So your main job was unloading ships?
Our main role was unloading ships.
Do you remember a particular day you were unloading the ship and you had a bit of a mutiny?
Oh, yes. Well, that was so called by the captain. We at the time, we worked 8 hours on and 16 hours off. When it came to the changeover, we expected, as we did, arrived on time. And the crew were supposed to relieve us at 8 o'clock at night. And the first night they were late, the second night they were late. So I said to the purser on the third occasion, I said, look, I said, if your chaps are not up on time, I said, we're off. I said, I don't see any reason why we should work longer than we have to. I said, because we're just as tired as they are. This particular night came and I said, all right, chaps, we'll give them 10 minutes. They hadn't arrived. So after that, I said, all right, close down the winches. The winch is closed down, the truck's piled up on the wharf, the captain's tearing around, tearing his hair out, and he said, "What's going on?" I told him. And he said, "Good gravy, we'll soon sort this out." Well, naturally, of course, the crew were up there in 2 seconds and taken over, and things got back into order. But at the end of the actual term in which we had of unloading the McNewy, the captain lined us up on deck and made mention of the fact that he appreciated how quick we were and how efficient we handled the winches. New to us. I'd never handled a winch before. And he thanked us. And of course he said, "What happened?" He said, "That was mutiny, you know." And we said, "Well, you can call it what you like, but as far as we were concerned, thought we were entitled to knock off at 8 o'clock. With that, he gave us a bottle of beer each and thanked us very much.
What was the morale like amongst the boys?
At this stage, getting very low. It was the most disorganised, untrained battalion, I suppose, that one could see when Brigadier Porter walked around. He classified, or General Morris, I think it was, walked around and classified as grade F. Now, that's a long way down the scale when you're getting A, B, C, D. And we were poorly conditioned. We were suffered badly with malaria, dysentery. We hadn't had scrub typhus. We were not in a scrub typhus area. As far as our training was concerned, was nil. We did very little. We had a few schools running of NCO schools. I went to a school. I learned how to fire a Bren gun. In fact, when we went into action at Kokoda, I was the only one that could fire it. So during the little time that we had before the Japs' attack, I taught a chap how to fire a Bren gun. When I say fire, that is how to load it and how to fire it and how to change a magazine. Prior to that, we had the old Lewis gun. So training in itself, we went out on one exercise and walked into a bit of the jungle. We stayed out, we camped out that night, heard a few crocodiles, never saw one. Other than that, we didn't even know what the jungle was even like.
Did you believe the Japanese were actually approaching Port Moresby?
At this time, yes, we had, which they call it furfies, or the latest news, where you always get them down at the latrine, of course. And we did hear, yes, there was movement, and of course after that, they, when you say coming down to us, they had already at this stage bombed Pearl Harbor. So it was pretty close to the mark, but we thought they would be coming by sea. And that is why so much emphasis was placed on the defence. We dug holes, we dug slit trenches, we dug communicating lines to join up with the actual trench positions. And if it weren't with the Australian Navy and with the help of the Americans, they beat the Japanese at the Cold Sea, which was, as well you know, the Americans really had the bulk of the issue, but doesn't alter the fact that the Australian Navy was there as well. So they stopped them in the Cold Sea. Now this put a big upset with the Japanese. They thought, well, they've got to get down. The only other way they can do it is go across by land, which they did through Manchuria, which they did through Singapore, which they did through Rabaul. Their idea was then to land at Gona and come across by land. And we knew that obviously was the plan, so we sent a lugger, which was a sort of native ship, around past Milne Bay and up to Gona with B Company supplies. And it landed, took the supplies off, and no sooner they took the supplies off and the Japs were on their way from Rabaul on their way down. So time limit, the supplies never got to Kokoda.
Were you told that you would soon be heading up the track?
Yes. We were then told we had to be prepared to walk the Kokoda Track. Now at this time it was people refer to it as always a mix-up with this track and trail business. At that time, it was a pad. It wasn't even a track. It was only a pad, which you refer to as where you could probably say a few sheep had walked through and had made a pad from village to village. They never used it as a communicating route from Kokoda, which was rubber, and copper from up further at Gona. It all came around by boat. So needless to say, there wasn't really a track. So when we started off, we had the information there that we had to walk the Kokoda to get there before the Japanese so that we could hold the airstrip. That was the ultimate, to get to the airstrip. The first company that went over was B Company. They arrived there. The Japs hadn't arrived. They'd only just landed at Gona. And they advanced up from Kokoda toward Gona and got to a village called Efogi. Were in the command of Sam Templeton, and they had their first encounter there. Overwhelmed, remembering the Japs had 10,000 and we had 1,000. And the time that it took very little time for B Company to be pushed back through Kokoda and back up to Deniki. During this time, we, the remainder, A Company, C Company, and Don Company, had arrived at Deniki. B Company had passed through our lines and were then in reserve. It was then the idea of Captain Symington to re-attack Kokoda. This was not entirely favourable with Alan Cameron, who was the CO, and I don't think it was entirely acceptable by the brigade. However, the attack went on, and C and Don Company went straight down. A Company went around to a side track at the side, and we went down and we took Kokoda.
Do you remember the first time you saw a Japanese?
Actually, the first time you see a Japanese, yes, you see them at a distance. But when people say, did you see them? And we were taught, you see, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. There was no way knowing you could see the whites of a Japanese eyes because they're not open anyway. They're only just two little slits. But the movement in jungle fighting, you don't see them. The jungle is too dense. You can't fight as a company. You can't fight as a platoon. You can't fight as a section. You fight in pairs. And that's the only way you could communicate.
Because of the thickness of the jungle?
The thickness of the jungle. There was no way.
Light? There'd be no light? Or you wouldn't have sunlight?
Very little. There's occasionally you'd get a break in the actual trees and you'd get a bit of light through there. But the line of communication, we were always taught to be silent. Surprise element is the best line of attack. The Japanese, when they first attacked us at Kokoda, we wondered what in the heck was going on. They made all the noise in the world, yelling out to each other, orders. We didn't understand them.
And were they camouflaged?
Oh, they were, oh yes, well and truly camouflaged. We weren't. We had khaki dress. We didn't even have jungle greens. We weren't camouflaged. We didn't even have a hole. We didn't even have it. When we arrived at Kokoda, the officers said, start digging a hole. Well, we didn't have anything to dig with. We didn't have shovels or spades. We had a mess tin. We had the heel of our boot that we'd loosen and we'd scrape it out with our hands. We didn't take much notice of it. War wasn't, everyone. But until the first few bullets came over, and it's amazing how much dirt you can dig out in a hurry. We dug all right. We got down just sufficiently that you got down below the earth line.
So where were you dug in there at Kokoda? You're on a plateau?
Well, Kokoda is the big, yes, is a plateau, and it has a fall on each side of about 100 feet down each side all the way, except when you come in through the rubber plantation.
Yes. So where was your platoon?
My platoon was situated, or my section was situated where Colonel Owen had unfortunately been killed when went down to have a look when he flew over and landed at Kokoda.
That was probably about a week earlier.
It was. And he walked around the plateau. Although he had advice from one of our officers to pull his head in, as the saying is, he wanted to find out exactly what the position was and so on, and unfortunately he was shot. And my position was exactly where he was shot. That was where the main attack was expected to come from, which was from Efogi, which was from Gona.
And how long were you there in that initial battle at Kokoda?
The Battle of Kokoda, the time we got down there, they attacked that night. And we held it for 2.5 days. And the only reason we had to get out was the fact that we'd run out of ammunition and we hadn't had anything to eat for 2.5 days. Somehow or other, Alan Smith, he was with the intelligence section, somehow or other managed to make a hot cup of tea. Now, how he did it, I don't know. But we did have a cup of tea.
Who was in charge of you at that stage, giving you your orders?
Our company commander was Captain Symington. Our CO at the time was Alan Cameron, our colonel. Although he was a major at the time, but that's by the by. He was the company commander.
And who was your lieutenant?
My lieutenant, or our lieutenant then, was Captain Frank Trotter. But unfortunately, we don't know. He was at Kokoda, and when we got out of Kokoda, we didn't see him after Ijarawa. He wasn't wounded nor killed, or he was retired, and obviously through sickness. But I never heard from that day to this, actually, whatever happened to him.
Who was Jim Cowie?
Jim Cowie was our company sergeant major, and he was our father.
He was a good bloke.
He was a captain in the 1418 MC, and he looked after us and walked around and made sure everybody was tucked in, as the saying is, and as comfortable as possible. Wonderful man.
After Kokoda, you were pushed back?
We withdrew from Kokoda because of the situation, ammunition and food, and we went out across. Getting out of Kokoda, we had to go down stairs, which were down the steep slope down toward the airstrip. As we walked along a path at the bottom of it, we looked up to the plateau, and there's a Japanese mounting a machine gun on a tripod. Now, if that Jap it was dusk, but if he had to turn a little bit to his left, he would have seen us walking along this track and out to there. For some unknown reason, we all walked underneath him. He never saw any of us. And we walked out around the corner, over a creek, and onto the airstrip, where we reassembled to walk then back up to Deniki. It was Jim Cowie, once again, the name will come up often. He made sure he walked down the end of the airstrip, he walked around the other side of the airstrip. He searched the area, almost in the dark, to make sure that we all got out. Having grouped together, we set off to go to Deniki. It was an old, disused part track, part jungle, when we then arrived at a village whereby the chief, native, came along and cooked us, in fact the Marys cooked us banana, taro root and sugarcane, which we chewed naturally good. And they themselves got out of their huts so that we could have a asleep. The following morning we assembled at dawn, and as we were starting to set off, Jim Cowie said, "What was that noise?" And we looked down the hill, and the Japs were down. They were camped just down the bottom. We were camped just up the top. So close, so near, so Jim Cowie said, "Well, we've got to move on." So it might sound a bit sort of thing, but he shot the Japanese that he could see, and on we went on our way. Now, we were out in the scrub then for just on 3 days, endeavouring, we were going to Deniki, but by this time the Japs had gone through Kokoda and on their way up and were taking Deniki, and there was a big fight on at Deniki with Don Simonson and Alf Salmon, and the Dean had been killed at Kokoda. So we could hear it. We could hear the fighting. There was no good of going in because we didn't know from what angle to go in from. So we had to circle around, and that's what kept us out in the jungle for so long. Eventually we did get back onto the track, which was almost at Ijurava.
How did you manage to sleep in the jungle?
I don't think you actually did sleep. You dozed. You were too frightened to sleep. Even now, it's the darkness is frightening. You don't. I think you just sort of exist at this stage. Mm. You're always wet. I rang a chap in Queensland only the other day, Pete said, "Why don't you give him a ring?" It was Alf Tuck, who looked after our watermelons. And he got on the phone and he said, "Good God, Don," he said, "the last time we were together," he said, "we were sitting on the side of the track, and he said, we had our feet in a puddle of water. He said, we were wet as shags, and he said, we leant on each other's shoulder and went to sleep." And so you really didn't. It really didn't get much sleep.
What about your food? How did you manage to get your
supplies?
Food,
we had, our ration was a tin of bully, or half a tin of bully beef and a biscuit per day. Once again, I harp on the fact I was a corporal. I had to see that my men were fed first and got their ration. But we had one chap in our section, which I mentioned earlier about being not slow as much as a little different. But in fact, he'd gobble down his bully beef and biscuit, and he'd come along and he'd sit in front of me like a Labrador pup. And he used to say, "I'm hungry." And I said, "I'm sorry, Pud." I said, "But you had your ration, I've got to have mine." I said, "And we're all in the same position." I said, "I'm sorry." And that's the way it is. But if you look in the eyes of a Labrador,
did you give
if you got any feeling, you'd break the biscuit in half and give him half a biscuit.
After Kokoda, you were heading back to Ijurava. And I believe you were told you had to dig in. Can you just take us through what happened there at Ijurava and how you dug in?
Yes. Actually, just prior to that, before we went down to Kokoda, we stopped by the side of the track and had a rest. But one of the chaps in my section came up to me and he said, "I'm sorry, Dan." He said, "I can't make it. I can't face it." I went back to my officer and I said, "I've got a problem here." I said, "One of the chaps," I said, "if we take him into action," I said, "he could be very difficult to handle if he cracks in the middle of a show." And he said, "All right, leave it with me." And he took him back to brigade headquarters and gave him the job as a runner. Now, I heard in latter months after that he was transferred to another company and he turned out to be a very good soldier. So the point there is that we are not all brave. We're not all in a situation whereby you can go straight in. It's very, very frightening, and there's a typical example. One chap we had shot his foot. Now, the rifle went off accidentally, and I think we can perhaps just leave it at that. Having done the Kokoda campaign, we came back to Ujaraba, and my position was where the monuments are now, which were opened by John Howard not that very long ago.
How many would there have been of the 39th Battalion left at that stage?
At this time,
Just roughly.
I would say, well, having lost that, or roughly adding in the battalion, I'd say about 500. They weren't all killed. There were a lot were wounded. We had a lot of wounded, and actually, of course, some of them were sick because the malaria was plentiful. So, in round figures, there would be about 500 of us, I suppose. And that was when the 2nd 14th Battalion, they joined us when we had arrived back at Ujaraba. We settled down at Ujaraba. Now, the Japs had received this terrible shock. They'd never been attacked before. The 39th Battalion were the first to ever attack Kokoda. The Japs had never been attacked, and it threw them off balance. Inasmuch so they sat down and they thought about it for, it must have been, we had a break there, I suppose, for about 10 days at Ujaraba before they attacked. We knew they were going to come, because that was our point. We didn't go with an intention of stopping them. We went with an intention of holding them, to delay them, so that it'd give our AIF troops a chance to get back from the Middle East and to come up to us. And that was the purpose of the delay there. But we had about a 10-day break before they reorganised, getting over the shock that they had been attacked.
And how do you remember the battle at Ujaraba? How do you remember it starting?
Well, it was such an onslaught. They came in with such a noise. They rattled cans. They yelled out to each other, and you'd really think they were having a rock concert. I can understand now. I was in the Scottish Regiment. I can understand now why it's so frightening. They used to send the bagpipes in first. It was something similar. It frightened the hell out of you. You hear the bagpipes, and the enemy, so I believe, frightened them. So it was a similar sort of thing. They made a hell of a noise, but they came en masse. You fire a few shots and you'd kill X number on the charge, and you would think we'd say, this is the wrong, we're going the wrong way. We'll infiltrate from the side. We'll go around this way. But not them. They just kept on coming, wave after wave. So it was a case of getting as much ammunition as you could, but it didn't seem to put them off. They just kept on coming.
I think the battle went on there for 2 or 3 days.
Yes.
And the 39th held them. How were you mentally at this stage? Were you getting weary and hungry and wet? What was your physical condition like?
Well, at this stage, as I refer to the ragged bloody heroes, inasmuch that they were so weak and no change of clothing, they were wet, and they were completely physically exhausted. And how they kept awake or even stood on our feet, I don't know. If it hadn't been for the 2nd 14th Battalion coming alongside of us, we would have been annihilated.
What was your feeling like as the 2nd 14th started to arrive?
Well, relief is a word used, but I think you can only thank God they were there. Oh yes, it was a marvellous feeling.
And then, do you remember Colonel Honour arriving?
Yes.
And what did he say to the men?
Well, he inspected all the areas, which as soon as he got there, of course, and walked around. He never spoke to the men as individually, at the Battle of Isuarava. He didn't really speak to the men directly until we got back after Isuarava to that nearest village, when he did address us and told us then that we'd done a good job. But now that the 2nd 14th Battalion were in big difficulty, would we go back? Not orders, would we go back and assist them?
And he asked, the message came
would
through.
Would we go back?
Would you go back and help?
Help them. Yeah.
Which you did.
Which we did. Except, once again, you're getting back to this weeding out. You couldn't send back the chaps who were wounded. You couldn't send back the chaps who had dysentery. You couldn't send back the chaps who were sick with malaria. And there were quite a number. Because and just physically not capable of going back.
Do you remember the withdrawal at Isuarava? It was about 2 a.m. in the morning.
Well,
or something.
Was, yes, I remember it too well. I had one of my position where we were losing men, and the cook came down the track, Ted Mitchell, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm holding this position." And he said, "I advise you to move out." He said, "I think I'm about the last out." So away he went. A chap from the 2nd 14th Battalion came down the track, but he was a sergeant. And he was calling out. Now, this is where the last of the Isuarava battle, after Win Murray being wounded and after I got signed, we withdrew down his position. He came down and he was calling out a name that I can't even remember today, and I should know it because it's impregnated in my mind, calling out, "If you don't answer, we'll have to open fire." Now, at this time, it was a mix-up. There was a 39th Battalion here, the 2nd 14th Battalion there were Japanese here, and it was the thickness of the jungle, and it was very hard to sort out where and who was who. So, but he said, "If you don't answer, by the time I count 10, we'll have to open fire." And it was during that time that I lost my number 1 gunner and I lost my number 2 gunner. We had no time. I knew I could see the bush move with the Jap, but you don't take any notice of that. When a bush moves, you don't open fire on that, because the Jap he'd crawl along and tie a piece of string onto that bush, and he'd crawl away a couple of yards and pull the string. You open fire onto that, he knew where you were, but you couldn't see him. So really, when you add up and say how many Japs did you kill, some question such as that is absolutely impossible, because you didn't, technically speaking, see them unless they were then charging at Isuarava, coming at you en masse. Then you saw them. But the rest of the battle, and most of the battle, you didn't see them. You fired in that direction, and there were a lot dead.
Was there a story about Jim Cowie at Isuarava?
Yes, Jim came through after the heat was off, and once again asked the question, "What are you doing here? You're holding this position." I had no one senior to me. Our officer had gone, our sergeant had gone. There's no one senior to me to tell me where to go. So I said, "I can't move until I get an order. Otherwise, you could, I don't say desertion by any means, but it made it very, very difficult." And he said, "Come on, Don." He said, "Let's get out of here." So he took the dog tags, as we call them, off foot, and we broke Bren gun because we couldn't carry it. And we went along underneath the track and arrived at a native garden. We climbed over the fence and got out to the middle of the garden. He said, "Hang on for a second, Don." He said, "I've dropped my knife." So I sat there and he walked back. And the Japs were up on the top track. We could see them walking along the track. And I thought, this is no place for me, so I made it to the other side and waited for him over there. He strolled across the garden. When he arrived, he said, "I found it."
After Isuarava, you made your way back down through Minari?
No, we went back then to Eora Creek. And it was at Eora Creek where Damien Perra met up with us. This is the first time we were on film. All these actions prior to that, there was nothing, there was no stories, there was no film work to prove what we'd done, anything. And it was here at this creek that I again met Ted Stewart, whom I had met going up, and all he said to me, he said, "Oh, Donnie," he said, "it's terrible, and that's his action at Oivy." And I told him about it. I said, "I'd love to be able to clean my teeth." And he said, "Here," he said, "use mine." He said, "You're the only one I loan my toothbrush to." We had to fight then at Eora Creek, and this is where the Japs got very, very close, and they started then to learn names of calling out various names that they'd pick up. Any name that didn't have an L in it, that's why all our passwords were Woogamaloo or Lulu. But a name like Smith, they could put their tongue around a name, and then they'd call out in the middle of the night, "Are you there, Corporal Son?" And of course, if he answered, that would be the end of that too. So you learn the tricks of the trade, as the saying is. You learn it very, very quickly, very quickly. And this, you didn't take any chances. You shot first and asked questions after. We didn't take prisoners. We couldn't afford to take prisoners. What would we do with a prisoner? You could get 3 men to take him back to Port Moresby. Port Moresby was 86 miles away. Our wounded, when they arrived back at Ijuraba, was the starting of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. They carried supplies up and they made a stretcher to take our wounded back. So all in all, you learnt very, very quickly.
Did you have a break then and go back further down?
Yes, most of us then had been relieved by the 2nd 14th, pardon me, and also by this time the 2nd 16th and the 2nd 27th battalions had come up and were on or about Brigade Hill, which allowed us then to pass through their lines and wend our way individually, mainly back to Port Moresby, which took days.
Did you end up in hospital?
I got malaria. Yes, I had malaria after that in hospital. And after I got out of hospital, I went then up to Hombom Bluff, where we were reorganised.
And word came through that you'd be heading north?
Well, word came through first and foremost that a few of us had been selected to go to an OTS, which was an officers training school at Canungra, which I just started a school in Queensland. But instead of that, Brigadier Porter made mention of the fact that he's giving us the pride and joy, and I don't know too much about the joy, of being head first into Gona, and supported then by other troops. There was the 53rd, and although it was broken up, we got a few of them as reinforcements. The 39th Battalion was the heaviest reinforced battalion in the AIF. We had more troops come through us than any other battalion. And we ended up with 39 standing on their feet after we finished Kokoda, and we ended up with 25 and 7 officers standing on their feet after we came out of Gona, Buna, Sanananda.
So you weren't to get any break. You flew into Popondetta.
We we walked back then to Popondetta. On the way, I had appendicitis actually. In fact, I'd reported it before we went over, but that was by the by. And I was shaven and ready to be operated on at a field hospital, and it was the same doctor whom I had seen in Port Moresby. And instead of being operated on, the Japs came over and bombed the hospital, which meant then I had a call then to Popondetta. When I arrived at Popondetta, the ground was too wet for the planes to land, and we had to stay there for a couple of days, and they said, well, we're not getting anywhere near any of you back in time. You have to go over to Soputa, and Soputa was a distance of about 6-7 mile. So I had to, literally speaking, crawl for that distance over to Soputa, and from there we got a plane back to Port Moresby.
And that was after you'd served action at Gona.
And that was after, yes.
What was the conditions like at Gona?
In most parts was worse than Kokoda. The conditions were very. You never get rid of the smell that was because the Japs had been annihilated, except the few whom we thought were left, but there was still a hell of a lot there in bunkers built well and truly strong with logs and camouflaged. Very, very hard to define, and they were very, very hard to get out. You had to, literally speaking, dig them out. They were dying for their country and all this sort of jargon they went on with. They were very, very hard to get out.
Who was your leader there?
Colonel Honour, and he did the same attack on Gona as he did the 1418 war, not he, that they did at the neck in 1418 war. And that was a barrage of artillery. We followed in behind the barrage, and it was split timing, absolutely split timing, which kept the Japs' heads down until the shelling stopped, and when the shelling stopped, we were on their bunkers.
Was Lieutenant Dalby in charge of you?
Yes, he was in charge of us.
And what sort of an officer was he?
Excellent officer, experienced, but very popular, and a good leader. He said, follow me. Yes, very good officer.
And were you at Gona for 2.5 weeks?
Oh, we were at Gona for, I won't nominate the actual time why, but we were there for a few days.
Yes.
Where we ourselves in August, because we went then on to Sanananda. And a few of them went down to Buna. And it was a few weeks after that before the actual whole of the actual brigade finished. But Gona, yes, we're there for quite a few days.
Do you remember the beach there? And
the beach was shocking. It was laden with Japs that had been killed. Of course, it had been strafed a lot by the Air Force, and it had been shelled quite considerably by the artillery. We had artillery to assist us.
I believe you were strafed there one day by the Kitty Hawks.
Yes, they got their own back on us there. They flew around, and we stood out on the beach and waved our slouch hats and said, hello there, and they did a circuit around an old wreck, which they used as a landmark, and the next time they came in and they strafed us. Fortunately enough, they didn't kill us. They weren't one of the native boys. But other than that, no, we were lucky we weren't all killed, actually.
So what was your job there when you went to Sanananda? What was the battalion's job at Sanananda?
I didn't know. I didn't go to Sanananda. I came out at the end of Gona. What happened at Sanananda and Buna, I don't think they went to Buna as much as they would action at Sanananda.
So were you wounded? Were you ever wounded?
Oh, well, I hit in the leg, but it was only a little, what they call a 2-inch mortar. It was like the size of a condensed milk tin, and it was more concussion. There was no shrapnel like we have on our grenade.
You would have headed back to Port Moresby?
We headed back, yes. That was a very difficult trip because of the fact that, I mean, we had so many walking wounded. It was bad enough getting back on your own, but to help with the wounded, getting back until we got right back into Iwabaya Ridge where we met the Salvation Army, who where he kindly gave us a cup of coffee. And then we got back to McDonald's Corner, and that was as far as the jeeps could come up. And then they transported us back to the hospitals at Port Moresby.
When did you get your first leave?
We got back to Port Moresby. First leave you get was what they call operational leave before you get your annual leave. And that would have been in the late December. And that was for a fortnight's leave. Then we went back to the Tablelands, where we were formed up again and were told that we have been withdrawn from the order of battle.
How did you feel about that?
And thrown on the scrap heap. Well, it was very, there were plenty of other battalions they could have deleted. It's such a famous battalion, it was very hurtful.
Very
Very
disheartening.
hurtful. And we had the choice. They gave us the choice of going to the 2nd Battalion, the 2nd 5th Field Ambulance, or the Provo Corps. Now, the ones who went to the 2nd Battalion had to be AIF. This is where you're getting back again, this distinction between militia and AIF. You had to be AIF to go to the 2nd Battalion.
You would have still been militia at that stage?
No, I was. A lot of us were AIF. The battalion became AIF, recognised as AIF at Ijurava. But prior to that, we were militia.
What do you think's important for the younger generation to remember about the battles that Australia fought in New Guinea?
I think the most important thing is the fact is that you've got to realise that and take things more serious, that the situations in the world as such, that these countries, they may appear to be friendly, they may appear to be this, but you must be aware that we are a likely target at any time at all, any time, and we have no defence at all as far as Australia is concerned. We have got a defence force, but if we don't stick with America, we're in big trouble.
Well, on behalf of the 39th Battalion History Unit, we'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting interview. Thank you.
Thank you.